What I have here in this new example that I've started, down in the body of my document is I have 3 different paragraphs. In each one of those paragraphs, what I have is an HTML tag. Inside the first paragraph, it's just a plain old anchor tag for creating a hyperlink. This anchor tag has an href attribute and a title attribute. The actual content inside the tag is Google. Down inside the next paragraph, I then have a div. The div has an ID, a class, some inline CSS, and a little bit of content in it. And in the third paragraph, I have a text field, an input tag type text. It has an ID, a name, and a placeholder. When I actually pull that up in my browser, this is the way those 3 tags actually end up rendering. What I would like to do in this example is see if we can replicate those 3 HTML tags by using a PHP object instead. Essentially what my idea is that sometimes it can be a little bit messy, a little bit confusing to try to output HTML using PHP. Well, what if we encapsulated that capability into a class so that we could create PHP objects that represent HTML tags, and if we then simply echoed the PHP object, the HTML would just come out, would just output. So here's my basic idea for this anchor tag. What I'd like to be able to do is put in a set of PHP tags, and I would essentially like to just be able to echo a new PHP tag. Or maybe I should say a new object of a PHP tag class, something like this. So I'd be creating a new object, instantiating a new tag object, and in that new tag object I would need to pass to it the information that would be necessary in order to create this particular tag. So what kind of information do I need for a tag? Well, HTML tags in a lot of ways are widely varied. They come in all kinds of different sizes, shapes, forms, names, attributes, all of those sorts of things. But if we simplify it, I could say that every tag has a name. For example, my anchor tag's name here is A. I could also say that every tag has some content. Well, that's not necessarily true. Every tag doesn't have content. My input tag here down here, for example, is self-closing. It has no content, but certainly a lot of tags have content, so that's a fairly important part of any tag. Every tag then also has the ability to take attributes, and again, just like the name and the content, the attributes that a tag can have vary drastically. There are so many different attributes or so many different types of tags. I would need to have something fairly flexible to be able to put all this together. Basically what I named off there though are 3 separate things, a name, content, and some attributes. So maybe those could be the 3 fundamental values that get passed to the constructor for a tag class. To replicate my anchor tag here, what if I passed A as the first argument? I'll pass Google as a second argument, and as a third argument for the attributes, since there could be any number of different attributes, maybe I'll pass an array. No reason we can't pass an array like we would pass any other value. So what if I put together an array? I could make it an associative array so that the name of the attribute is the key and the value that goes with that key is the value that goes along with that attribute. So I'm thinking something like href as a key, which would then have the value of Google's URL, and then as a second attribute, I could have title, and for the value of the title attribute, I could have a search engine. So with that information being passed there to the constructor, that should give me enough information to be able to encode, reconstruct that anchor tag. Let's see if we could actually make that work. In my file with the HTML document in it here, I'm already here at the top of it requiring a file called tag.php. I've started that file and I have nothing in it at the moment other than an empty set of PHP tags, but this is the place where I could then start my tag class. So I'll go ahead and start off by defining class tag. There we are. And the first thing I would probably want to do in my tag class is go ahead and give myself some variables, variables that would basically represent the attributes of this object. I'm going to want this object to be encapsulated. That's just part of good basic object and class design. So let me start off by creating 3 private variables. I'm going to have a private variable called name to store the name of the tag in. I'll have a private variable called content, where the content of the tag will go, and a private variable that I will call attrs, attributes. And that's where the actual attributes array will be stored. Now, to allow those values to be initialized when a new object of this type is created, let me give myself a construct method. Here we are. public function underscore underscore construct. I'll set my construct function up so that it can be passed 3 different values: the name of the tag's content, and the tag's attributes. There we are. In this case, I made the names that are being passed here as arguments to my function the same as the actual names of the variables that I have set up inside my class. But since the variables that are inside the class always have to have this put in front of them, I should still be able to differentiate between the 2 of them fairly easily. So what if, for example, I said, into this name, assign the name variable that was passed to this function. Into this content, oops, extra question mark in there, assign the content variable that was passed to this function. And into this attributes, ATTRS, assign the attributes variable that was passed to this function. Hopefully that will allow those 3 pieces of data to be passed in through the constructor. Now at the moment, I'm not actually doing much in the way of any type of validation, trying to make sure that those things are correct or not. There's a little bit of validation I can see myself doing, but really not a lot. For example, I would say that it is required that every tag have a name. There's no way that name can be blank. Every tag has to have a name. It can't just be a set of angle brackets. But as far as what the name itself actually is, unless I really want to go off the deep end and actually validate that it is a valid HTML name, which I'm not 100% positive can even be done, then I'm probably going to have to stick with just making sure that the name isn't blank. As far as content is concerned, the content isn't even technically required. The content could not be there at all. That would be fine. Same thing with attributes. It's entirely possible that maybe I have a tag that just has no attributes whatsoever. Think of a break tag, for example. A break tag has a name, but it would have no content, no attributes, most likely. So that might be a bit of a good start there for our tag class. If I jump over to my browser now and hit refresh, looks like I actually do have an error. Object of class tag could not be converted to a string. We should know at this point what's causing that. When I'm actually trying here to, on line 26, create my new tag and then echo it, PHP is put in a position where it needs to create that new object and then actually convert it into a string, and at the moment it doesn't know how to do that. We can use another one of our magic functions, another one of our special functions, of course, to make that possible, and that's really what I'm going to need to do as the next step in creating this tag class. I'm going to go ahead and create public function underscore underscore toString so that I can teach PHP how it is that it's actually supposed to output a tag object. So here, what I more or less want to do is I want to reproduce an HTML tag. An HTML tag has this sort of basic form where I have the tag's name here, I have its attributes here, and I have its content here, and then its name again right there. That's obviously not valid PHP, but that's kind of a little bit of a template that maybe I can start with. I think maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an output variable, and I'm going to start off my output variable by putting in the opening angle bracket, and then I need the tag's actual name. So let me append to that this tag's name. After the tag's name, maybe I'll throw in a space to separate it from any attributes if the attributes happen to actually be there. Now, if there are attributes, if we do actually have an array in our ATTRS variable, then what I would need to do is I would need to take every attribute that's in it and I would need to turn that into an attribute here in my output. So how about I put together a for each loop, and I'll say for each of this object's attributes, taking each one as ATTR as attribute. Actually, now that I think about it, each attribute has a name and a value, doesn't it? So how about I say, taking each one of them as a name and a value. I could then take and start appending those onto my output. So into output, let me append the attribute's name followed by an equal sign. That equal sign would then need to be followed by the value, but in HTML it's required that we have quotes around the value. So to make my life a little bit easier, maybe I'll put single quotes around that equal sign. I'll put a double quote after the equal sign, and then after the value I'll put in one more double quote. So the double quotes will become actual characters that are being output that will surround the value itself. And I'll put a space in right there, so if there's another attribute after it, there'll be a space there, like there should be. I think eventually, once we're through that for each loop, then we should have the opening angle bracket, the name, and a list of whatever attributes may or may not actually be present. Then I need the closing angle bracket right there, so let me go ahead and append that in next. So to output, I will append in now a closing angle bracket. Not a big deal, but I think I'm going to come back up and I'm going to change the quotes that I had used up above here to single quotes. I had done double quotes initially, but now that I'm finding it necessary to use single quotes everywhere else, just for consistency's sake, I'm going to go back and make them all single quotes. The only double quotes that are being used here then are the ones that are actually being output as part of the HTML tag. So this angle bracket then is the closing angle bracket on the opening tag. The next thing I need in there then is the actual content, if there is any. So let me go ahead and append to what we already have, this object's content. There we are. And then all we have left to do then is to construct the closing tag. So onto my output variable, let me again append. This time I'm going to do an angle bracket slash. I'm going to append to that this tag's name, and then I'll append onto the end of that the closing angle bracket. So hopefully with all of that, I've ended up putting together my little tag. I think maybe I'll just comment out my little template I put together there in case I need to refer to it again later. And let's jump back over to the browser now and see how that works. Back in the browser, I hit refresh, and it's telling me method tag toString must return a value. I did forget that, didn't I? I went through all that trouble to put that output variable together, but I never actually returned it. So down at the bottom of my toString function, let me return my output variable. Back to the browser, refresh, and there we go. And look at that. Our Google is doubled. The first one is the hard-coded HTML I wrote. The second one must be from the PHP tag object. Let's look at the actual code that's being generated. Here it is. Inside that first paragraph, here is the hard-coded tag. Here is the one that's being generated by my PHP. They are almost identical. There's very little difference that I'm seeing between the two of them. Certainly nothing all that important as far as differences go. I think the only difference might be is I think I have a space after this closing quote here that isn't there on the original one, but that's certainly still valid, no harm done. We could get rid of it, but it would add some unnecessary complications, so I don't think that's really worth bothering with. So far I'm pretty happy. To kind of test it out and see if it really is working, let's try it on some other tags. If I come over here to my div tag, I wonder if we could go ahead and reproduce it using PHP now. I'll put in a set of PHP tags and let me say echo a new tag object. This tag object's name is going to be div. Its content is going to be big div, and its attributes as an array, I could say it's going to have an ID attribute of big div. There we are. It's going to have a class attribute of has border, and it's going to have a style attribute. And the style attribute has a bit of CSS in there. Let me just copy and paste it in. Anything's faster than me having to retype it. There we are. Makes for a fairly long tag, a fairly long line of PHP putting all that together. But let's see if that actually works. In the browser, refresh. Sure enough, big div looks like it's been duplicated. Looking at the code again, the code here for big div, I have the original, and I have what my PHP generated. Again, they look almost identical. The only thing I'm seeing that's different is that one extra space I have in there, which, as I said before, is not a big deal of any sort. So that looks pretty good. Something else that we might want to think about with these tags that we're generating is, are they actually dynamic? The way I'm putting them together right now is that I can actually create the tag, but what if I wanted to be able to later change the tag? For example, here with my big div tag, instead of echoing it immediately, what if I put it into a PHP variable called div? Would I then be able to later echo div, but in the meantime actually make a change to it? For example, for div, what if I wanted to change its style attribute to something else? Instead of the style that we had in there before, which was background color gray, padding 20, what if I wanted to set background color to blue? Would that be possible? Well, if I go over and I give it a try right now, I don't get an error, but it also doesn't actually seem to have any effect, does it? What's actually happening here, hopefully you remember from the previous video, is that when I try to assign a value to a style attribute of my div object, PHP's built-in __ set method is taking over there, is creating a style attribute and is assigning it this value. The problem is I don't want that value assigned to a new style attribute. What I want it to do is I want it to actually be assigned to an attribute I already have called style. What I would need to do then is I would need to modify my class a little bit so it understands that when I talk about an attribute, that attribute should already be a part of the class itself. So back over in my tag class, what I would actually need to do here is override and customize the underscore underscore set function. So if I put in public function underscore underscore set, the set function here would be passed the name of the value I'm trying to change and the actual value that I'm trying to change it to. What I could do here in the set function is I could say if the name that I'm trying to set is name, so if I'm actually trying to change the name of the tag itself, then I could say into this object's name attribute, put that new name. I could do then essentially the exact same thing for the content. If the name of the attribute that we're trying to change here with this function is equal to content, then into this object's content, store the value. I just realized up here I typed name, didn't I? I don't want the actual name there. What I want there is the value that's being set, which would essentially be the new name. It's getting a little bit confusing in that I have a name variable as part of my tag class and a name variable here. I've got name variables all over the place, as a matter of fact. That's something I certainly might want to reconsider. Last possibility here, though, is what happens if the value we're trying to set isn't the name of the tag and isn't the content of the tag. Well, if it's neither one of those, then I think what we should do is we should assume that whatever it is we're trying to change must be one of the tag's attributes. So all of the attributes are stored in that attributes array. So what if we said into this object's attributes, into an element that has the key of whatever name we're trying to set, assign whatever value we're trying to set. So the idea is that should, I think, make this line that I'm trying to do work. The name that's passed to the set function will be style, and the value that's set will be this new CSS. So when we get to the set function, style will be name, and the CSS will be in value. So the name is not name, the name is not content, so we should end up down here in this else. In this else, we'll say in the attributes array, change the attribute that has the key of style, which should be where it was originally stored up here when I created my constructor. And then I'll say put the new CSS in there. Let's jump to the browser and see if that works. Oops, doesn't look like it. Line 18 of my tag class, I have a parse error. Here it is, line 18. Looks like I forgot my semicolon on the end of that line. Let me correct that and back to the browser again, refreshing. Hey, there we go. That seems to have done the trick. If I again look at the generated code, my original hard-coded div is still there, and now I have my generated div. And my generated div, despite the fact that it started off nearly identical to the hard-coded div, has now had its CSS attributes changed by passing it through that set value. Let's try something else here real quick. Let's go ahead and also add a get function to our class. We actually haven't at this point come up with a situation where we actually need the get function, but it should be relatively easy to add. If I put in public function underscore underscore get, the get function will be passed the name of the attribute that we want to get. All we really need to do is return the proper value, and that's going to be very much like the way that we set the proper value. If I take that same if-else that I put together for my set function, and I'll just change it a little bit to where if the thing we're trying to get is name, I'll just return this object's name. If what we're trying to get is the content, then I could just return this object's content. And if what we're trying to get is anything else, we'll just try to return that value from the attributes array. Might be a good idea to check there and see if it actually exists, but even if it doesn't, it should just return nothing, which is probably what I would have to do anyway. So that get function is a good complement to our set function. Like I said, at the moment I don't actually need it, but easy enough to throw in at that point since we were just working on the set function itself. All right, we have one other tag down here that I haven't tried my class out on. That's this input tag. If I throw in another set of PHP tags and I echo a new tag object from my class, in this case the name of the tag would be input, its content would be nothing, no content in that one, and then its actual attributes would again be a new array. In this case I would have a type attribute with a value of text, I would have an ID attribute, and I'll give it the value of phone, and I have a name attribute, also has the value of phone, and then finally a placeholder attribute, which has the value of a fake phone number. Not really fake, it is a real phone number, right? Just not one that's especially important to us here at this moment. So there we are. If I jump over to my browser, refresh, looks like it did a pretty fine job, duplicated my input tag. If I again take a look at the output that's generated, In this case, the output that's generated varies more than just a little bit from what we had before. Here's the actual hard-coded input tag that I have. Here's the generated by my tag class input tag. You notice that with my generated tag, it puts an actual ending tag on it, whereas the original was self-closed. Is that a big deal? I don't think so. We could run this through a validator and find out if that's still okay. I think it is. But even if it isn't, or even if it is, we might want to go ahead and fix that anyway. I think it would be a relatively easy thing to do to simply look at the content of the class. And if the content is empty, couldn't we just have the tag self-close? Back over in my tag class again, down in the toString method where all the code is being generated, this is where I'm actually creating the closing tag. This is where the content is being generated. This is where that closing angle bracket for the opening tag is ended. So I think the basic decision would become which of these lines do we need to do and how. The way that I have it now is more or less the behavior that would occur if content is not blank. So what if I just throw in an if statement here, and I'll say if not empty for this object's content. So if we actually do have content, then I create the end of the tag that way. Otherwise, what if I took this line where I'm appending the closing angle bracket for the opening HTML tag to output, and I did the same thing, I just put a slash in front of it, so it becomes a self-closing tag. Let's see how that works. Over in the browser, refresh, everything visibly looks the same. In the code itself, yeah, it looks like both of my tags are self-closing now, the one I wrote by hand and the one that's being generated by PHP. So that seems to have done the trick, and all it took was one little if statement. In that if statement, one little thing I might do is I might actually want to turn this around. I'm not crazy about having nots. So let me get rid of that not operator, and then what I'll do is I'll just swap these two sections around. So more or less I just turned the if statement upside down so I could get rid of that exclamation point. So now it just reads, if the content is empty, self-close the tag. Otherwise, put the content in and do a closing tag. That's a fun little practice. There's probably a whole lot more we could do with this tag class. It's a good example to kind of work with. It's an interesting one, I think, and it's one that even is potentially valuable, since trying to translate PHP statements into HTML tags is something that's done fairly commonly and can be a little bit obnoxious to do sometimes. It might be potentially handy to us in the future to have a class sitting around that we could use to be able to quickly and easily write HTML for us.